Folks, I want to welcome all of you to our very first event in our summer seminar series for 2020. As you all know, our summer conference got a chance to change its look, and today's our very first expedition into that new look. Now, I know that today's a pretty amazing day for each of you because you got some information about the state reentry plan a couple of hours ago. Are you in luck? Today, you've got Kevin Baird, who is going to help us begin to address practices that work well, that have already proved themselves, and the data and things that you'll need to be able to look at and work through to help successfully move your district forward with your students. I'm delighted to welcome Meteor Education. You know, they are one of our key sponsors, one of our platinum sponsors for the Coalition of Education Leaders. And when we had to bust this conference up and change its format, guess who stepped to the plate first? Our friends out of Meteor. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Kevin Baird. Kevin?
All right. Well, hello, everyone. And good morning, good afternoon, whatever time zone you might be in. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I am joined today by my colleagues, Sue Ann Hyland and Ruth Bruss. And Sue Ann and Ruth, they are going to be monitoring our chat. And really, it's intended to be a discussion. I chair the Nonprofit Center for College and Career Readiness. I also work with a variety of different educational organizations. And actually, since schools closed in the middle of March, I've actually talked with more than 1,000 school districts around the US. I actually had a consult with the CDC last week, and the center, as well as the Successful Practices Network, we published a study, which was to date still the only study actually looking at what happened to our students. We looked at mid-March to the end of April, and we'll have another study coming out looking at students to the end of June. I'll get all of those materials to you, but I just want to note that all of those voices really led to what we're going to talk about today. And I want to begin by giving due to some of those voices. So if you don't know Ray McNulty, you might have heard of Bill Daggett. Ray is the president at the Successful Practices Network. He's one of my great colleagues and friends. And I'm going to draw on a lot of his thinking. Mason Davis is the former chief academic officer in Duval County Schools, Florida, and a person who's always in my ear. And Dr. Paige Detman. Paige is a former administrator in Sarasota, Florida, and she serves as chief education evangelist at Meteor Education. So my thanks to them as we get started. I want us to really kind of think about in the beginning our priorities, where we really see ourselves right now. So this is a great opportunity to get your fingers ready, and let's chat it up. Go find your chat box. What do you currently see as your top 1 or 2 priorities for fall 2020? Please find your chat box. I'm going to say hello to everyone. Make sure that you type to all panelists and attendees. I'm going to say hello, everyone. Welcome. And what do you currently see as your priorities for back to school? And we already have Sri Montoya, social emotional learning. Please do chat it up. Go ahead.
While we're getting that, if everybody wants to make sure when you click on that chat that you on the drop down click that to say all panelists and attendees, and then everybody in the whole group will get a chance to see your chat.
There we go. Vesta has it. Very nice. Meals for all students, access to learning for all students. I saw Valerie's in there, ensuring that all of our teachers have tools in that virtual environment. Ensuring our instructional staff are really equipped to meet the learning and the social needs of our students. Many folks are still thinking about the technology plans. I'm sure some of us are still thinking about, wading through the guidance that just came out from the state, right? I know that there was a task force. I had an opportunity to just look at that before we got on this morning. Health and safety of all students. Assessing where students are as they enter next year. Hesper, thank you so much. We're going to talk about that. Really benchmarking and being able to respond right away. Hybrid environments. All right. Well, our goal today is actually to maybe help you refine some of your thinking, not just about what your priorities might be, but about how we actually execute those priorities. So I'm going to start with some data that comes out of the following study that I already referenced that we did with the Successful Practices Network. And Ruth and Sue-Ann, they're going to keep chatting it up. And so please, a big important part of today is your conversation with your peers. So just because I'm talking doesn't mean you want to stop chatting. And that's one of actually the best practices when you're in this kind of environment is we can all be talking together, even though you have only one person speaking verbally. Some ideas that you have, a response that you have, a question that you have. So let's begin with what we know about kids. If you follow the various research that's come out, NWEA, they had the first study, they were actually looking at some projections based upon January data, so that's before things closed down, as to where students might end up for back to school. The Successful Practices Network and the Center for College and Career Readiness, through an agreement with Achieve 3000, Achieve is one of the most utilized reading intervention and digital education platforms in the United States. We're able to look at the records for 1.6 million students. And we actually looked at data from the entire school year before and after the pandemic. We started our analysis on Wednesday, March 11th, and then looked through April 30th, 2020. And again, there are 3 more studies in the works. One of them, the next one is with the University of Kansas, looking at student engagement. Some things that we found. Even when students had access to technology, 76% of all schools showed decreased usage after schools closed. You probably have seen this. I was on the phone with one of my colleagues in Chicago Public Schools that got technology to all of their classrooms. We were talking about 4th grade, where literally in 4th grade, 1/3 of students on any given day were not accounted for. So as we think about our students coming and going, whether they're in our classroom or at home, we know that the student engagement in the task of learning is likely to be less. And I also want to note in our next paper, we're actually looking at some data relative to teacher engagement. And what we found is that in this time, teachers were also significantly less engaged. And I think we can all understand why that might have happened. Right now, as I speak to you today, the data from where students actually ended up at the end of May and then even looking into June, we see that students are likely to show up having lost about 5 months of expected skill. So I want you to think about whatever grade it is, the students coming into that grade this fall are likely to come in somewhere around 5 months less in terms of their skills, okay? 5 months behind where we would have expected them to be. And the gap, so that's everybody. The gap then for the widening of achievement between those students who have generally done well and those students who are average and those students who are already behind, that gap actually looks like it's going to increase about somewhere between 15 to 20% depending upon the student. So everybody moves down. And then the gap between the kids who already struggle and those who have been doing well is increased by about 20% inside of that data. Struggling readers are on track to fall behind their peers by an additional 6%. Some students were succeeding, and I'm going to talk about some of those outliers because I think they have some guidance for us. But if you think about the acronym FAPE, a free, accessible public education, I think we have to really dive into the idea of access back to this fall. If our students are coming in literally, say to the 6th grade, but they're really at 5th grade at 1/2 year. This actually is a graph showing that actual data. And it's really interesting because one of the things that ended up being a big aha in looking at the data and thinking about what it said to us was that the gray line here on the bottom are actually our average students. If you think about what we do in schools, very oftentimes we ration our programs that move students ahead the fastest, because the kids who we need to move the fastest are often the kids that are behind. So our average students very often are not in our accelerated programs. Our average students are in our general education classes. It's the kids that are in our general education classes, interestingly enough, who are very likely to lose the most because they were not in an accelerated class. And that's that red line. And if you look at the red dotted line, and then you have these green lines that go down. What are those green lines? Those green lines, July, August, and September, represent what we would normally see with summer slide. So we made an assumption in our study that kids essentially were going to be stable. They were going to be steady state from wherever they ended, say mid-March. That's when we started our analysis. But that's probably a pretty optimistic finding, okay? Because we know that we had fewer kids that were actually engaged in the act of learning. We had fewer teachers that were engaged in a full-on teaching simply because it was crisis teaching. It wasn't online learning. That's not a critique. And we know this. We know that students who are from lower income homes or from lower language homes, all right? And I'll give you here's my best example of a lower language home. That's a student where you have two parents. One parent might drive a Lexus, the other might drive a Mercedes. Both of them have great jobs and they're really busy. And there isn't a lot of conversation at home, and the students don't have a lot of engagement at home, and they're not talking about the news, or they're not talking about the world. Those are lower language homes. And it used to be the lower language homes were especially in our low income zip codes. And that's still, it's true. But even today, with all of our kids with their earbuds in, we find that lower language homes are now more evenly spread out across demographics. So be careful, because we could think about, for instance, our Title I kids, our Title I schools, because we like to, categorize everything in education. It could be many students who generally, back to this, might have been doing really well. They're in that grade. They were our average kids. They might even have been our AP kids. What happens to an AP student who all of a sudden comes back in and it's not easy for them? School isn't easy for them. They're behind significantly, maybe for the first time in their life. That has implications for how we address those students and their social emotional needs. These could be students who've never had a social emotional need at school ever, all right? Because their impact is really different. So I want you to just consider that data for a minute. What do you think the implications of that data are for your back to school planning? Let's chat it out for a moment. I'm going to look at the chat box. I'm looking at Sherry Williams. So Ms. Williams, I've done a lot of work with the Bureau of Indian Education. I'm sure some of my colleagues are probably here. I can't see all of you. We know for our Native American students, we have less access to technology. We likely had fewer students that were engaged fully in the act of learning, much harder to reach. And those students are already behind, and they may also be in language deficient homes. So you're absolutely right. You also have all kinds of specific needs around social emotional learning there. So that becomes a really specific issue for that demographic, right? What else do we think? Just looking here, let's chat. What do you think this means for your back to school plan? If you had to pick one thing you were going to ask all of your principals to do or all of your teachers to do, what would you ask them to do? Again, Hasper, absolutely. We have to know where the students are. We really have to understand where our students are coming in, and we have to really aggressively think about like the first 90 days. And one of the really great things I'm going to talk about is we know how to catch kids up. We actually know how to do that, but we're going to have to focus on that. And it isn't just our kids who've traditionally had IEPs. I'm asking districts to consider How do you create an operation where you look at every student as if they needed an IEP right now? Making connections with students and building relationships. We're going to have some example. That's actually a lot harder than we might think and absolutely critical. Ensure that their parents are comfortable sending their students back to school. And also asking our parents, I think, how do they engage with their students? How can we help our parents be really active partners in helping their kids catch up? I'm going to suggest to you that that's a lot about conversation and less about worksheets and homework, right? Oh, set aside deficit thinking, explore kids' strengths. I love that. Absolutely. Listen, we were talking before we came on. This is an opportunity to actually do some amazing things, and we know how to do them, all right? We're not lost, and these students aren't lost. Truly, they aren't. As a matter of fact, if you look at the studies from recent pandemics, we've been lucky in the US. We haven't been impacted like we're being impacted by COVID, but a lot of other places have, places in Asia, places in Africa, places in the Americas. And what we see is that eventually kids do catch up. It just might take them a while, but we ourselves have to have a growth mindset, right? All right. So I want to give you another piece of information, and this speaks directly to the social emotional piece. So this data is from the University of Central Florida, Nicholson School of Communication. And they do a lot of research on the impact of stress on human communications. And this is what they find. In a stressful situation, we take in between 1/2 and 1/3 the amount of information. So I want you to think about for back to school, your scope and sequence, all right? Your pacing guide for the first 90 days of back to school. I don't care what your pacing guide is, your kids are very likely to absorb somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the pacing guide. I've been speaking to folks. Let's think about what can we take out of the pacing guide? Letting our kids dig in and sit in to concepts, sit into the things that are most critical. Folks, I'm giving you permission right now. You're not going to, quote, cover all the standards. Here's the good news. My friend Andy Porter, he's conducted the single largest studies on standards-based education in the world ever. It's called the Survey of Enacted Curriculum. It doesn't matter. We can get rid of some of those standards, all right? Think about the things that are really critical. But here's another issue. We know that when we're really stressed, we actually process at a lower level. For adults, we process about 4 grade levels below our regular listening grade level. Now remember, we listen a little bit higher than we read. But that means that if you're let's say you're coming into 8th grade, I'm likely going to be processing not at 8th grade. I'm going to be processing probably maybe 7th, maybe even 6th grade, maybe even a little bit less, depending on how much stress is going on in my life. And by the way, a little shameless plug. I have a new book out with my co-authors, Rex Miller, Bill Latham, and Michelle Kinder. It's been 3 years in the making. We had no idea that COVID was going to happen, but we actually were studying stress and the impact of stress on education. Here's a big takeaway from that book, although I'd love for you to get it. You've got a Habitat for Heroes and go get it. But the big takeaway is this. If we don't address teacher stress, we're going to have a lot of student stress. That we really have to ask our teachers where they're at. And that means leader to teacher relationship, not just teacher to student, leader to teacher. How are you doing? Did anyone in your family lose your job? How is your partner? How is your spouse? Are you missing anyone in your ecosystem whom you had because maybe they passed away, right? What's your life been like, or what is it really like? Are you sick? How much fear do you have coming back to work? So let's think about some of the implications for back to school planning there. What's the implication for your pacing guide? What's your implication for scope and sequence? How about your onboarding? Anybody thinking about onboarding for back to school? Your in-servicing. I'm suggesting to everyone, if you can swing it, a week, 2 weeks of in-servicing. My colleagues over in San Diego, they actually, when COVID struck, they gave themselves 3 weeks, 1 week to prepare in the administration, the second week to prepare with their teachers, the third week just to bring in students who needed more time. And we have other examples of that. Folks, Miami-Dade just released their plan. They're going to bring in their, they call it fragile students, their most fragile students, several weeks earlier, and they're making summer learning and a whole bunch of other kinds of programs and wraparound supports available, not just to the students, but to the teachers, all right? Okay, I'm just looking at the chat implications for back to school planning. So I want you to think as a leader, am I bringing my teachers back earlier for in-servicing? Am I giving my teachers an opportunity to sit in and think it through and plan it out before I even bring my students back? Am I modifying my pacing guide? Am I giving permission that we're just not gonna reach all of it? That's okay. I might actually be thinking about making a 24-month plan to catch up, not a one academic year plan. So let's keep going a little bit on the data. This data essentially is showing us some of that difference between the achievement gap between students from low income and high income schools, and where we saw that 18%. We literally already saw an 18% gap between those students. And this is data that supports that idea that just because you had access to online learning, and I saw in the chat, some folks like, hey, we have one-to-one devices. Are the students actually using those one-to-one devices? And here's some other policy considerations. So is LETA is in El Paso. They let their kids take their devices. They let them take their devices home. They knew a lot of their kids were actually going to go back to Mexico, literally across the border. That was fine. They made sure that they had supplemental devices for their kids because they were going to get damaged, but they couldn't not let their kids take the devices home because that was essential. Also, what kind of content was being downloaded onto the devices? Thinking about in your lesson. So I want you to think of a lesson plan. Inside of a classroom, if students coming back in the fall, if they are working on devices, do I specifically set aside time at the end of my class period to make sure that students have time to download and get their content ready for work at home? That takes time, by the way, and that takes direction, and that takes help with the students. Just one very specific idea we can do. Now, interestingly enough, this is some really fascinating data, and I just want you to take a look all the way over to the right side of your screen. This is data from students that were online. They were online before closure, and they were online after closure. Okay, so these are kids that had access. And these are reading comprehension scores. Interestingly enough, for a huge cohort of students, we actually saw them reading better. Why? Time. And as Ray McNulty, I'll tell his story for him. You might have heard it. He says he was presenting to a school board. He was actually a teacher, a principal in Vermont, and then he was a chancellor for the state. But he was presenting to the school board, and there was a school board member who's a dairy farmer. And the dairy farmer said, Principal McNulty, I only know one thing. If you chase 2 cows, you will catch none. And the message from that dairy farmer, which I think is a really important message for us, is setting a very specific set of goals and chase just one thing, and allowing your teachers and your students the grace to settle in. Our assessments, our standards, our curriculum, they are too full. They are too full for the stress that our teachers and our students are seeing. They are too full for the idea that I'm only going to take in a half to a third. They are too full for the idea that I'm going to come in 5 months behind. We need to take out and decide what are the things that we can abandon. But when we do that, students actually learn faster. And that was one of the crazy findings here. That 67 to 71% was an amazing finding. So I want you, I'm really challenging everyone here that's with us. Could you write into the chat just one thing? It could be across your entire curriculum that you might be able to get rid of. And I'm gonna write in the chat the one thing that I would get rid of, okay? They couldn't look up the answers, Vesta. Actually, interestingly enough, they the data that's from, those are real reliable and valid assessments of reading comprehension. So they couldn't cheat, if you will. Here is my nomination if I had to get rid of something. And I want to make sure that I spell this right. The unit on Phoenicians. So when I was teaching in the middle grades, I had to teach, and it was always funny because we always had the unit on Phoenicians, and I was like, I don't understand. There are some really interesting things, some ways we could get at that content. My kids were always a little bit lost. And then when we had new standards that came out, which they were actually talking about river societies, I had the opportunity, because our little town was on the river in Wyoming, by the way. If you didn't know that about me, I actually grew up on the plains of Wyoming. I went to a one-room schoolhouse called the White School for a time. But I actually got rid of that unit on Phoenicians, and we talked about water rights in Wyoming and how the waterways of Wyoming had an enormous impact on how our communities interacted, and also on both our history with our Native Americans, of where their tribes were, if you know anything about Wyoming, the Wind River Reservation, and also around our economies. So it's interesting, Vesta says, I'm worried that the state isn't going to adjust end of course tests. One of the things I want you to think about with our end of course tests, most of our end of course tests today are not content specific because there's too much content anyway. They are asking our students to be able to read at a specific level and to think at a certain level of cognitive demand. Now that's not always true in math. And if I have certain EOCs, right, certain end of course exams, I could have trouble there, all right? But even so, I could analyze that, and I'm gonna suggest as a follow-up, the center, we have a leadership grant program. We'll actually help you do some of that analysis if you want to think about some of the things that are most important there. But if we don't get rid of some things, guys, our kids are going to fail anyway. So we know that if we take out some of the superfluous information and make sure that our kids can read and think, scope and sequence, right? Scope and sequence is the enemy of understanding, especially today in this scenario. I like to say coverage, the idea that I'm going to cover it all. Coverage is actually the enemy of comprehension. And that is more true today than it has ever been. So I want to talk a little bit about some districts that really were seeing success. And I already mentioned Mason Davis, who's a former chief academic officer in Duval County Public Schools. Duval spent the last 5 years building a machine, just a machine of adult fluency. A very few things that they wanted their adults to be able to do really, really well. By the way, that's a question you might write down. This fall, by the middle of September or the end of September, what are 3 things you want your adults to be fluent, to be really able to do? Well, they wanted their adults to be really fluent in a specific routine for reading online. They have 2 programs that they use for reading. They wanted them to be very, very fluent in a very specific approach to mathematics. And in their digital tools, they wanted them to hit their work hard on Mondays and Tuesdays so that they were pretty much done by Fridays, and Fridays were just a review day. And if you look here, I know those are dates, but you see the pattern that you have. Really, they hit it out of the ballpark, and then that last day, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that 5th bar is always lower. You see that routine writ large. Interestingly enough, the minutes that their students were spending, this is just in one specific platform, the minutes went up, the comprehension went up. The number of lessons, that's coverage. The number of lessons went down. Coverage went down, but student comprehension went up. Really interesting. And that was very specific. In consultation with them, early on, we said, let's let the kids sit into the content. Now, there's another story here, and it's this first number, 81,000 to 63,000. By the way, Duval is one of the largest districts in the United States. They have an enormous issue with kids being able to access things online. And so they printed materials that were exactly the same as the content online so that they could have phone conversations with kids, because kids could get on the phone. They could have phone conversations with students even if they couldn't get online. And I think for our students who can't get online, that's something I want you to think about. Can I have a phone conversation with a student even if they're not online in a web scenario? All right. In Marlborough Township Public Schools, I like to call this the land of the Lexus and the minivan. You can see that in their proficiency scores. They actually had a very similar experience, but their experience was for a different reason. They focus on data explicitly. And literally, they were able to shift so that they were moving into this scenario where they could take their kids, again, land of the Lexus and the minivan, their kids do really, really well. They were able to almost immediately transition to a place where they could see into each individual student. And they came back every Friday. Every Friday was simply a day where their administrators, their data teams, and their teachers got together and they talked over every single student to ask, what does that student need next? And that gets to some of the things we were just talking about, to really think about, how do I move, in APS, in Albuquerque Public Schools, how do I get that to a place where I really am thinking about each student as having that IEP? So some conclusions from the study, by the way, I'm going to get everyone, you'll get the full study. We already know immediately what we started to see from mid-March to the end of April, already significant skill gaps. And that has implication for what our curriculum is back to school, but it also has implication for our teaching strategies. And I'm going to suggest to you, and I'm going to show this a little bit later, pull out just a few teaching strategies that normally you would use in intervention and use it in every single classroom, my friends. Even in every single classroom, just a few strategies to move our students forward. A few super important intervention strategies, okay? I want you to think about a 24-month plan to catch kids up. And if you think about your state assessment, your kids, I would prepare right now. I just had a conversation with a super high-performing district in California. Like, guys, let's just prepare our Board of Education, our community, to say, you know what, next year on our tests, we are likely to see a gap. But we're going to make that up over 2 years, but just be upfront about it. Anybody who believes that your spring state tests next year are going to show the kinds of results that you've been getting, whatever those results are, that's a fiction. Those results are going to go down. And we need to give ourselves as leaders permission for that. It's okay, because our kids will eventually catch up. But the stress didn't magically go away. COVID didn't go away, right? Schools differ widely. And I'm going to ask you to consider, we think about differentiated instruction. I'm really asking you to consider what differentiated leadership looks like, because not all schools are the same. All right. If I have a res school, if I have a school that's an Indian school, right? That's literally a school affiliated with a First Nation. And then I have a school that's affiliated with a VIE, and I have a school that's affiliated with my public schools. Those are three super different scenarios. And that isn't just about the kids being in a different scenario. That is about the leadership need being different. But ask yourself for those places, what's the fluent human adult activity? All right? Because there are success stories. So, which data points resonate? What are you already doing? What barriers are you most concerned about? Can we chat up barriers just for a moment? What barriers are you most concerned about? Vesta says content that's on it that is year-on-year low scoring on assessment, is it not normally successful? I'm not exactly sure what you mean, Vesta, there. But what I would say is one of the things that we're going to start looking at, and I know that this will happen state by state, but also be part of our national conversation, is actually looking at norm student responses. And remember, there is good news there because we'll see some of that kind of start to even out, right? So I don't know about your school specifically, if they're how you report if there's a challenge or things went really well or whatnot, but we'll start to see all of our schools are going to be impacted in that same way. And again, the schools that give our students time to slow down and our teachers to slow down, they're the schools that are going to get ahead. And I'm going to show you a real life example from Florida where we did that as well. Oh, yeah. I love it. Vesta says, for the pacing guide, take the stuff that was low scoring anyway. Amen. Amen. Just rip it out. I actually had one administrator once in a PD, and they were ripping out pages saying, we don't have to worry about that. In math, if you don't know what I mean by the math fluency standards, I want you to email me at the end of this. There are explicit standards that lead to fluencies there, okay? What are some of the barriers? So technology and student access. Again, I really want us to think about that. If our kids, we really need to think about if our kids don't have access at home, what that conversation is. Are our kids, and I know that there are masking requirements in the guidance that just came out today. Can I have a conversation where I provide students with some instruction and give them a way to practice explicit skills at home and then come back to the school for new skill instruction and then practice at home? Okay, so I want us to think about, from that implication, what we need to do to get our communities of teachers, our communities of parents, our school boards on board. So I pulled this out. This was actually an article from late May from US News. Back to school, 1 in 5 teachers are unlikely to return to reopen classrooms this fall. If you haven't surveyed your teachers and your parents, I'm really going to ask that you consider doing that. If you need a survey, if you want a ready-made survey, email me. By the way, we'll say this, Sebastian or Ruth or Suen, put in admin@edcenter.org, admin@edcenter.org, ADMIN. Or you can, Ruth, you can put in your email, Suen can put in your, there are ready-made surveys that we could send you, that you could give to your parents, that you could give to your teachers, but ask them, are they going to come back? How scared are they? What do they need to know, right? So here's one of the things I know. One of the things I know is that if you look at the transmission between kids to adults, this is from the CDC, by the way, transmission from kids to adults is very, very low. So if you don't want to have your kids go hang out with grandma and grandpa, but transmission between kids and adults is pretty low. So if I was scared that my kids are going to go to school and they're going to bring it back into my house, if grandma and grandpa aren't in my house, it's lower risk. If grandma and grandpa are, then I'm going to need to mitigate against that. Okay, what is our community feeling and thinking? The next couple of slides are from my friends at Ignition Institute. All right, you might want to talk with them. They do strategic leadership development. So, by the way, does media education. So again, you can connect with Sue Ann or Ruth. Thinking about beginning at interviews. See that interviews? That's also surveys. Asking, what are the external forces like fear? What are the internal forces like fear? What are the internal forces like tests? What's my team dynamic? By the way, are all my teachers returning? How many new teachers are coming in? Do I know if my teachers are coming back? And then what are the patterns, both with my students and my staff? And I love this piece, asking, as a leader, do I have enough clarity of what is my vision and what are the essential things I'm focusing on? Team, if we're focused on more than 3 things coming into the fall, we have a challenge. We are very likely not going to succeed. Do we have enough clarity for what that is, what it looks like? And I'm going to talk in a minute about what it sounds like. Do we have clarity of the outcome? I.e., our kids are all coming in below. I'm suggesting to you that we think about our indicators of acceleration. How fast are our kids growing? What content were my kids gapping on, and can I catch them up to that? All right. And what are our methods? And that's what I'm going to suggest to you. Think about proven methods for intervention that I can use absolutely everywhere in every single class, and just train the heck out of them. Talk about them every single week. They're our agenda, right? The Las Cruces agenda, the Albuquerque agenda is XYZ. We need to make sure that we have enough clarity, enough cohesion, and then you'll notice right here at the bottom, the discipline to stop doing something. I don't know for each of you what you need to stop doing, but I know you're going to have to stop doing something because we don't have enough time, and our kids are not coming in with brains that are going to take it all in, and neither are our teachers. The conversation around what are we going to stop doing is as important as the conversation about what are we going to do next, okay? So I'm going to give you an example, and then we're going to pause. We're going to have a little conversation. I want you to think about if we said in Albuquerque Public Schools, every single day, we want every single teacher to begin the conversation, kids, how are you feeling today? I want you to put on a happy face on your paper, a sad face. I want you to put on the word hungry if you're feeling hungry. I want you to put write down the word scared if you're feeling scared. How are you feeling today? I could say that. I could say I want every teacher to begin every classroom with that check-in. But you know as well as I do, that's not going to happen unless the leadership every day begins a check-in with the teachers. How are you feeling today? Am I responding as a leader to my teachers? And if I have some way to monitor that, if I have some way to understand what's going on. By the way, Meteor Education will get you right now a software for free. They negotiated a free deal with a piece of software that actually allows you to do something like that. I'm not advocating for the software here, but I am advocating for the idea that I can't address social emotional needs without asking about what do you need socially and emotionally, all right? Here's another example. Here is the #1 absolute best activity in every single classroom from K-12 if you want your kids to catch up. Increase the amount of academic vocabulary that's spoken in the classroom. By the way, you cannot see that. You have to hear that. That means as a leader, I'm no longer doing visual observations. I'm doing audible observations. If you were going to achieve one of those things, you pick. What are you going to have to do? What does it look like? What kind of conversation? I'm asking you to think about just one fluency. What are you going to have to do inside of your district? Okay? Here are some other things you might think about. Do you have a contingency planning for back to school? Wave 2. Almost everyone is saying that we're likely to see a significant wave of virus come back sometime in the late October to November timeframe. What if all of a sudden we close down schools? Again, completely closed down. What's a contingency plan? Are we asking our stakeholders what worked during the COVID closure time, or what needs to improve, or what are our concerns, needs, and priorities? What do we need to do to hone in on just one thing? I love the chat. I completely agree. We need to establish a new learning baseline for our students, but also establish a social, emotional baseline for our students and adults. Where are they? Every day. Increase pre-planning with adult wraparound services. If you don't have a psychologist on staff, a social worker on staff for your teachers, can we figure out how to get one? They need it. We need it. And be prepared for more time planning to prepare our students and our teachers to learn. Okay, so let's sit in that. Let's chat it up for a minute. How do we achieve just one thing? Okay, just one thing. What are some thoughts? And we're just going to chat it up. We're going to leave it right here. We know that this is real. What can we as leaders do with our teams now to focus on just a few elements of adult fluency? Okay. I really want you to always check in. I really want you to increase academic vocabulary. What does that really look like to create that priority? Remember back to this. Do we have clarity? Do we have cohesion amongst our teams? And do we have enough discipline to stop doing what we're doing? Let's chat it up, guys. Let's see let's all share. We have more than 50 people. We're going to create some space for chatting. That's silence. Have a clear message. Ask, by the way, does everyone understand? How do we create a clear message? How do we workshop what it is we're doing? Stan says we have to model what we expect, right? If the district leadership team doesn't have coherence, if we're not all talking out of the same playbook, right? That's a problem. If I come in and I'm doing audible observations and I've been talking about academic vocabulary, but I all of a sudden go to something like collaboration, or I ask, you didn't have the standard written on the board. You know, my mind is going to explode. I'm not actually focused on just that one thing. How do we keep everyone informed, but also informed about the same things? I'm going to talk about in a minute the idea that what gets scheduled gets done and what gets on the agenda gets done. Do I have a standing agenda every day, the same 3 things that are in the top of my head? Every single principal, the same 3 things that they're focused on. By the way, a really interesting thing to think about is there a survey that goes out to your teachers every day or every week around the same 3 things or same 4 things? Sherry Jet, thank you so much. Creating opportunities for the adults to process their own trauma and loss and anxiety. I was in a really powerful conversation recently, and I appreciate the district that did this. They took their PD time, and instead they changed their PD time to be coffee talk time, and they just shared what's really happening in my life, what's really going on. Giving our teachers the space to actually talk about what's real, what are they really feeling? What are they responding to? Oh, I love it. Valerie, check-in buddies to ensure that no adult falls in the cracks. Awesome idea. Absolutely. And by the way, that's for our leaders too. During COVID, when everything was happening, I started regular texting every day. I just texted with a small group and said, how y'all doing? All right. Some good ideas. So that all really gets to a shared vision. And I want you to think about that. A shared vision is actually about shared conversation. What are the things that I'm always talking about over and over and over and over and over? And that's the idea of cohesion. All right. And by the way, sharing the success stories. Hey, I had a real breakthrough today with Jane. I had a real breakthrough today with John. I had this conversation, a colleague of mine, former chief academic officer in Chicago Public Schools, who's retired. And she was enlisted to do online learning. And so she asked the parents who are home, the parents to sit by their kids. And she one day said, oh my gosh, I actually had most of my parents sitting with their kids online, okay? Because they were out of work. So the next thing I want us to think about is how we create urgency around whatever it is we're choosing to do. And by the way, the urgency might be stopping things, might be getting rid of things, all right? A priority is different from an urgent priority. And by the way, I'm going to suggest to you that if our school is coming back, can't tell you what the 2 or 3 absolute priorities are for the next 90 days, we have not created urgency. Because urgency is about that consistency, okay? This is from a website I really like, leadershipconsulting.com. And it helps us think about how we actually communicate a need for urgency. How do I hear urgency? When I walk into a building and I'm having a meeting, I'm doing an observation, whatever, the last conversation I have with the building leadership team before I leave, part of that should be, I heard urgency around this, but I didn't hear urgency around this other thing. Do we all know these three? Someone, by the way, I just want to note, I really want to honor it. In the chat said, I'm concerned about getting food to my kids. This piece of software that Meteor will get you for free asks right now of all the kids at home, everywhere, are you hungry? And they created a data dashboard that allows people at the state level to look around their communities and see where their kids were hungry. If the number one priority is to make sure I'm feeding my kids, do I know every single student that came in and is hungry? And by the way, do I have something for them to do? I work in Fresno, California, and they always in the office had a stash of granola bars. You know, the protein ones, the ones that make you feel really full. And if you have a weight issue like me, they're not good for your weight as an adult, but they're great for kids that are hungry. They always had a stash. Any kid who was hungry could come in at any time and get one of those granola bars. I don't know what you're planning on buying for the fall, but I would suggest to you that a hungry child is very likely not going to be impacted by your super sexy curriculum that you just bought. So how do I hear urgency? How do I see urgency? That when I walked into the classroom, did I see that every single teacher was asking the students, hey, check in. How are you feeling today? Are you hungry today? Are you scared today? All right. And then to what was in the chat, communicating clearly, effectively, and with consistently every single day. What are the three things? And maybe it's that check-in every day. Are your kids hungry, guys? Do we know? Did any student have someone that just fell ill or died? My kids, my colleagues in New York City, they have horror stories about kids that you know, they had a grandparent or an auntie that passed away, and we didn't know about it. Those are the kinds of things, and we might have to have really uncomfortable conversation. And by the way, provide an incentive or reward for that urgency. Yes, and by the way, that doesn't have to be money. All right, we had 90% of all of our schools report back, and they were able to say that in every single classroom, they asked about how their kids are doing, and we made sure that we had protein bars for the kids that were hungry. Basics. Vision, your vision, whatever that is, whatever you create with your vision plus urgency, that's actually your ability to transform what's happening in your schools. And I'm saying to you, I think we really need to transform what's happening in our schools because our schools have different needs, right? And you know what? The need is not something to do with the end of your test. So creating that vision and sense of urgency is number one. But remember, that leads to, do we have enough clarity, enough cohesion, and enough discipline? Those are three great questions for a survey out to your teachers and out to your community. What's your clarity? Survey to clarity, survey to cohesion, survey to discipline. All right. Now, here's some really great news, but I'm gonna poke on a few things here for a minute. Did you know this is data from this is actually from Achieve 3000? So full transparency, I work with Achieve 3000. I created their technology 20 years ago. I'm a fan of them because they actually move students forward more than 400% of expected. Whether or not you use them, you use something else, you use iReady, Curriculum Associates, whatever. We know the best practices. What Works Clearinghouse tells us the best practices where we can actually move kids forward. Do you know that in 90 days, I can move students forward more than a half year in terms of their reading skills? In Chicago Public Schools, Annette Gurley, their former chief academic officer, is one of my great friends. In 6 weeks, she moved kids forward 6 months. That is not a lie. That is not hyperbole. She did that. And we can do that. You know what she did? She focused like a laser on academic vocabulary. And we can do that for kids who've been struggling readers, but we need to think about doing that for our kids who previously have been AP kids, because the AP kids, they just slid back as well. And by the way, that's also true in math. One of the things we know about math and Summer Slide is that all students, no matter whether you are at the land of the Lexus in the minivan, you're from the rich family, you're from the poor family, you're from the family that has a lot of conversation, you're from the family that has no supports, all students in the summer move backwards in math if they aren't using your math brain. It's part of how the brain works. But interestingly enough, what's behind that is not we truly believe, do we truly expect that all of our kids are going to be able to move forward? And by the way, just in the chat, I'm getting a little note that it says my audio might be a little sketchy. So if my audio is sketchy, let me know, please. From teacher expectations, what's my combined teacher self-confidence and my combined student self-confidence? A self-confident student is going to succeed. A student that believes they can is actually going to succeed. So I want us to think about what's our expectation around teacher self-confidence? What's our expectation around student self-confidence? Because these are the things, you know, if you think about social emotional learning, what that means, this is what it actually means. It means that my teachers are confident about what they're doing and my kids are confident about what they're doing, okay? This, by the way, is from the work of John Hattie, visiblelearning.org. The other thing to think about isn't just, am I confident? Do I have high expectations of my students, but what's getting scheduled? What gets scheduled literally gets done. And conversation drives action, all right? If I am asking every single day to have conversation, what's my academic vocabulary of the day? Forget the standards, by the way. What are the words and the ideas that I am talking about today that my kids are really gonna come away from understanding? That's significantly more important than a standard. Whatever is in your urgent action plan, are we scheduling it? Because what gets scheduled gets done, and conversation drives action. And by the way, this is one of the places where as leaders, we often get sidetracked because we end up having conversations about things that, you know, it's like squirrel, right? Like we have new test scores or new data, whatever. Oh, squirrel. Please think about what are the 2 or 3 things we just have to drive home for the first 90 days, the first 120 days. The tyranny of the calendar can be okay. So let's think about what actions do we need to create urgency around? What actions will you take urgency around? What will you create? And how will you use your time? And I don't know about you, but I'm suggesting to folks, I want to make sure that we have a lot of time, super amount of times, talking to our principals, talking to our teachers, more so than ever before. You know, we waste a lot of times in meetings. If it is not getting out there and really seeing what's happening and getting focused there, let's do that. What do we want to be urgent around? So I did want to think about some indicators of action. So I'm going to move there and then we're going to think about what the environment looks like, okay? So I want you to think about what you're looking for and what you're listening for, where you're going to put on your agenda to discuss every week and discuss every day. And we're going to look at some best practices that are thinking about expectations and confidence. All right, what we're looking for, listening for, we're going to talk about. Here is this is a real life district. Okay. If you look at the little blue bar, it says, I know that I need every month my kids to gain 10 Lexiles, and I can measure that. There are lots of programs that measure Lexile. Lexile is a measurement of how well students read. I know that I need kids to gain 10 Lexiles, all right? Or excuse me, that's what they are gaining. I need them to gain 15. And I want you to think about this. I know that the kids are gaining 10 Lexiles a month, and I know that I need them to gain 15 Lexiles. If I look above, in that bar above, it says that my kids are only doing 1.1 reading activities a week, and their average first try score is about 67%. I want them to be at 75. Only 28% of my kids are meeting their goal. What does that say? I could focus on a specific activity. Read more, read more, read more. Number one, where's the schedule for reading? How do I need to make sure? How many activities are my kids doing? I want them to do 2 activities a week, not 1 activity a week. Double it up, guys. What needs to stop? By the way, true story, in this real life district, the teachers, this was data from a reading intervention class. And the teacher said, we're concerned because in our reading intervention class, we need our kids working in on grade level content. And the on grade level content is taking a long time, so our kids aren't in accelerated content. And district administration said, stop the presses, stop that train. Our kids, they're spending the rest of the day in grade level content. Don't have your kids in grade level content, have your kids in intervention content in your class. Because we know in that content that's going to stretch them, that intervention content, if I get them to 2 activities a week in intervention content, they're actually going to move forward. It was a very simple thing, but we had to give them permission, guys. We had to give them permission to stop what they were doing because they thought, oh my gosh, I need to have them in grade level content. But the kids couldn't read grade level content. Think about that for back to school. If your kids coming back to school are 5 months behind, and everyone all of a sudden has them in grade level content for the grade they're coming into, how badly are your kids going to fail? How much longer is it going to take? Maybe you need to look at the content not that you would design for August, September, October in 8th grade, but what was the content that students would have been in April of 7th grade? Okay? Think about that. You could focus on one specific activity here. I could look for that. I could listen for that. I'm going to show you. I'm going to skip ahead here. I want to give you 2 data points, and then I want you to think about a few really basic practices that I'm asking you to consider to put on your schedule to create urgency and priorities around. Because we can catch up, but here's the deal. If I am really super far off in reading, this data is from the ACT. If I am really super far off in reading, at the end of 4th grade, I have a 7% chance of catching up by 8th grade. That's what that says. I have a 7% chance of catching up if I stay in my regular curriculum, if I don't do something special, if I don't get rid of some stuff and slow down. And guess what? If I'm really far off in reading by 8th grade, I have a 6% chance of catching up by the end of 11th and 12th grade. So what this says is forget your pacing guide, forget your scope and sequence. My kids are already falling behind. Let the kids settle in. So what do they need to do? Well, for one thing, I need to think about a 24-month or a 36-month plan. And that's what this says. Beginning in grade 5, if I just keep doing what I'm doing, my students are likely, they're not going to catch up, all right? They are likely to fall behind. They're going to catch up over time. And I am giving you permission today explicitly. I am an expert in reading acceleration. It's one of the few things I know about. Your kids are very likely not going to catch up in 9 months. Create a plan over 18 months or 36 months to catch them up. All right? I need us to think about agreeing together what we're looking at, what we're listening for, and how we are responding, and giving ourselves the time to do that. Consistency of discussion, not the reports, the discussion, making sure that we are focused on a set of principles. What are those? For leaders, the following data is from the Wallace Foundation. And I know I'm gonna pause for a minute, hopefully to chat. I hope you're taking some notes. I will send you these things to read. The Wallace Foundation says that when it comes to data, our best principles, they're not focused on all the numbers. They're asking, what's our story? What is the one compelling story? And that story should be focused on what's our urgent action point, all right? So if we have a thing we're really trying to do, don't focus on all the data, Focus on just one piece of data. And that goes back to that graph that I just showed you, all right? Where from that real life district, focus on just Lexile growth. Just Lexile growth. We know the kids need to make 15. We're only getting 10. Well, what are we doing? They should be doing 2 activities, not 1 activity. Get them out of grade level content if that's where you're at. A compelling story. And if you look down here in bold, planning, implementing, supporting, advocating, communicating, and monitoring. I suggest that if you look at your own schedule, planning is what you're doing now. Implementing is likely your first 90 days. And think about how much time you are spending as a leader just supporting the implementation by advocating for your folks. And advocating goes back to asking, how are you? Are you scared? Are you confident? Are our kids confident? Are our kids hungry? I'll give you that information. These things are the critical categories of work for our leaders, all right? We know that we can catch kids up. We can catch kids up. We can grow them 300 to 400% in their ability to read. And you can do the same thing in mathematics. By the way, the kids who are behind, they'll grow faster. But it takes letting them sit in very specific acceleration. And that means we've got to get that to all of the kids, not just the kids who would be our kids that are normally behind. Get the good stuff to all the kids, all right? Reading drives everything, guys. And reading is based upon conversation, literally vocabulary. I want to go, because I'm watching my time. Okay, I'm there. I'm not crazy. This is from the Hart and Risley study, just if you don't believe me. The Hart and Risley study said something really, really powerful. That learning acceleration is all about words going into the ears of students and coming out of the mouths of students. It's not about how fast I'm going through content. It's literally about the richness of the conversation. ASCD did the same study. They look at the level of academic vocabulary. We need to make sure that we have super language rich conversations. Talking in the classroom. And by the way, talking in the classroom is something that isn't happening at home. So the kids do some of the practice at home, the writing at home. Let the conversation be really rich in the classroom, collaborative conversation. If you think about the content, we want to use the content for conversation. The content isn't just about reading. The content is about conversation and talk about what it means, all right? By the way, down here, you'll notice in the bottom corner, it says, begin with questions around agree or disagree. Whatever the, do you agree or disagree that it's important to study the Phoenicians? There you go. Whatever your content might be. Begin with an idea and have a debate about it. Call on those who are quiet. The kids who aren't talking are the kids as a leader I should be most concerned about. All right? And make sure if you're online, offering up the ability to chat or via voice. Call on the kids that aren't engaged. If you look at this is content that comes from the What Works Clearinghouse, and I will send this to you as well. The most impactful strategies. Here, this is for our English language learners in elementary. Number 2, focused intensive small group interventions for English learners determined to be at risk in reading programs, all right? Making sure that I am focused on explicit direct instruction for those kids, especially thinking about vocabulary. And number 5, 90 minutes a week where I have pairs of kids that are talking. And I am super concerned about this when it comes to the environment. I'm going to show you a picture of that. Making sure that our kids are talking. The most important thing for the L's is having the ELL kids talking. And by the way, it's not just them. It's the actual same thing over here on the right. This is improving adolescent literacy. All the adolescents, not L's, all the adolescents, all my secondary kids. Extended discussion of text meaning and interpretation. And by the way, interestingly enough, when I have more kids talking, that increases their motivation and engagement in literacy learning. So you're getting a trend. Hopefully you feel what I think should be on that agenda: urgent action for conversation around academic vocabulary and meaning. But here's the rub. all right? I'm providing you, if you look at the slide deck that I'm giving you, I'm actually giving you a whole bunch of pictures. Now, Sue Ann Highland is here on our webinar today. So is Ruth Bruss. They actually have a whole set of webinars that not necessarily you, but your teachers and principals can attend to think about what needs to happen in your classrooms and what they need to look like. And here's why. One of the recommendations that came out of the CDC was to have my kids in rows, forward, just looking forward. I'm begging you not to do that. If I have my back to the rest of my classroom, I can't collaborate with them. I can't. What Meteor Education did is they actually got interior designers and instructional designers together, and they did a bazillion different kinds of designs for classrooms, asking how can I have classrooms that are physically distanced and still have kids in the classroom? Or how can I have dividers so that my kids are safe, but my kids can collaborate? The classroom on the right that you see right here, this is not physically distanced, by the way. I'll show you one that is. This classroom started with conversation, a curriculum based upon best practices with my friend Doug Fisher out of San Diego. And then they built the classroom environment around it. And this is actually what it looked like in Sarasota. This collaborative classroom can be executed at a distance according to CDC recommendations. It can. We have modeled this out. This classroom drove 20% increases in outcomes in science and math and 2 times gains amongst girls and striving learners. The environment is never neutral. I could show you a school filled with research that says if I have classrooms where all of my kids are in rows, a Rip Van Winkle classroom, and my kids are not set up to collaborate, I'm not going to do the things that I just showed you from the What Works Clearinghouse and the Institute for Education Sciences says are the most important things to do, which are language in my ears, language out of my mouth, collaborating with my students. And by the way, one of the CDC recommendations is pair up. You have your kids in the same pairs. If my kids are going to spread virus, all right, have them just spreading virus with the same other kid. And that way, if this kid gets sick, I know who they're paired to. But please, I am begging you, if you walk away from collaborative conversation, your kids that are coming in 5 months behind, they're not going to, they won't catch up. I'm sorry, they won't. So our response needs to make sure our kids are not further behind, that they are accelerating faster. I have a white paper. I just finished it. I literally just finished it today because we had a consult with the CDC. The CDC has a variety of things that they say you might consider. I've taken every single one of those considerations and provided some feedback to you, some recommendations for how we can make sure that our kids are still collaborating, all right? And I'm gonna show you just a few pictures. Number one, if you have devices, please make sure you're bringing those devices into the classroom. Your kids can be in a classroom and they can be collaborating device to device. They can literally be working on the same virtual paper with each other, seated 6 feet apart, all right? Or seated a few feet apart with a divider, but they are using the device as their means of collaboration while they're talking to each other. And this is a implementation. This is created by Dell Computer. And I just want you to notice something here. If you look at this picture, I have a person in the back corner, all right? And that person in the back corner could actually be collaborating with the kids at the front of the classroom here on those screens. And Dell is suggesting, think about how you use a screen to create small little groups of conversation, small little groups of conversation. Use those devices. The devices aren't just about having the kids collaborate at home. The devices can be used in the classroom. Now here's the rub. And I've been suggesting this to folks. If it were me, I wouldn't spend bupkis on new curriculum, I would spend money on making sure I had power so that my kids could actually use those devices, all right? Because the devices run out of power in the classroom. That's an important thing, all right? So technology can create that seamless experience. This is a free resource. It's called Actively Learn, activelylearn.com. It's a full online curriculum. Your kids, it's seamless from what's happening in the classroom to what's happening out of the classroom. Great tools for you to poll your kids. It's literally designed to drive them to think more deeply, and it's free. I love it, activelylearn.com. And you can use it whether you're in the classroom or at home. Think about those kinds of things, but choose just a 1 or just a 2. The next research paper that we're doing is in looking at a variety of indicators with the University of Kansas. And this was stunning. This is from more than 1,000 kids, asking them about their teacher interaction with their lessons when they were online. And nearly half of them said their teachers weren't involved at all in their lessons. If you are preparing for a hybrid interaction, how do you know if your teachers are involved in the lessons? What's your expectation? Are we talking about your teachers involved in the lessons? What does it look like? Do I have some indicators? Just poll your kids. We know that direct instruction is critical. 42% of the kids said that the teachers were not involved in direct instruction. That is a disaster of epic proportions. We need to make sure that doesn't happen in the fall, okay? So what do I look for? What do I look for? Do the kids say on their weekly surveys that the teachers are involved, right? How's it going for the kids? Survey the kids, ask them. What am I listening for in the classroom? I'm listening for everyone's using this one thing I've asked them to do. I have rich academic discussion. And by the way, my kids are not in rows. They are working together collaboratively, and they're in their pairs. I also want you to think about, there are some ways, I know everyone is worried about physical distancing. A critical way when I have small classrooms to have my kids physically distance, all right? You probably know there's not a lot of conversation right now. Really, we're not really concerned about virus transmission from surfaces. I hope you know that, from surfaces. We are concerned about virus transmission in the air, but not so much on surfaces. So think about air. What's my ventilation? All right, my air moving around. But I want to think about where my kids are in the traffic flow. So here, I'm gonna fast forward because I'm giving you lots of images. This is an example of creating a traffic flow where the kids come in the door. The little blue box is their sanitation station. They all sanitize their hands, okay? They go directly to their pods. They all always have the same pods, all right? And then they come out this way. By the way, the teacher flow is the same way. And I've set up the little brown things are my bookcases. I just rearranged my classroom so that I was using my traffic flow. The same is true in the hallways, all right? Think about kids all jumbled up, hallways. On the right, go this way. On the left, go this way. Use direction and pattern flow as a way to social distance. I'm gonna show you a couple other drawings. Again, Sue-Ann and Ruth, they're offering, there's a whole set of webinars around these kinds of things. Here's a media center that's been rearranged. So in the media center, whoops. Oh, sorry, we'll do science lab first. Science lab is really interesting. So on the left is the original layout with 40 students. On the right, this is actually laid out. And you could do it for more students, but what they did is instead of having all the kids, you see that I have all the kids at the tables. I just rearranged to have the kids on different sides. And then I had shared storage right at the beginning. But also, here's the shared storage. I used traffic flow. Every single student had a specific sink to go to. So by asking the students always to go to the same sink, I am not just controlling what the kids are exposed to, but I'm literally controlling the traffic flow as a way. And by the way, I have sanitizing stations at every door. So I hope you get a sense of, if I think about the environment, I can still have my kids. They are not all face forward. All of these kids are collaborating. I should be walking in my classroom. I can see the collaboration, I can hear the collaboration. But I can also be looking for, am I using traffic flow to make sure that my kids are physically distancing. Here's a cafeteria. In the cafeteria, you can see what it was like beforehand. Now, what I did in the after cafeteria is I actually set up the cafeteria so it could be used as a classroom for some classroom settings. So these are what we call rearrangement services, all right? And rearrangement services, Meteor Education is providing these services for free, to help you think about how you can distance while having educational adequacy. And educational adequacy means I'm physically distancing, but I'm socially collaborating. So today I provided you with a lot of stuff, but a lot of information thinking about what am I doing when I'm socially collaborating, right? I want to make sure I'm focused on academic vocabulary. I'm going to make sure that I'm focused on that conversation. It's not about coverage. I want to make sure I'm taking things out and I'm letting my kids sit in, all right? Giving kids, by the way, making sure you could put a tape on the floor for my kids, how they're moving around. Making sure that I'm using the innovative pedagogies so that my kids in those innovative, all my kids have an IEP. They're all moving forward, right? Thinking about what I'm doing in that first 90 days. And adaptivity is more than furniture. This is the last thing I wanted to note. I talked about this. Meteor, they went out to Rhythm and they said, listen, can I get this software for free? You don't have to do it as software. I actually made these into little flashcards. But this is an example of this software called Rhythm, rhithm.app. Maybe Ruth, if you want to put that in the chat, rhythm.app, or Meteor can get it to you for free. But here was the deal. Every single day, not just the kids, but the adults, the kids and the adults would just click on 5 sets of icons. What's it in your head today? What's your energy today? How's your social interaction today? All right, are hungry, etc. And then anything you'd like to add. Now the software gives you a set of activities, but the most important thing actually, and we did this by the way, Ruth could tell you, we did this with all the adults in our organization to ask them, how are they doing? And this was a way, one, to make sure that we were actually always checking in, because our teachers and our kids need to check in. This is a way to actually do it every day, and you can see it happening every day. Number 2, to be able to respond. Again, I could see who was hungry. I could see when I had a COVID outbreak, I could literally see who was fearful, who had sickness in their house. Because when those things happened, I needed to differentiate my leadership and my instruction. All right, guys, we just went, we have 3/4 of our classroom. They're not here today. They're out because we got the virus in the house. We know that's happening. We're gonna have a different kind of conversation today, all right? And the same thing for those kids. So this is Rhythm, rhythm.app. You can get it for free. It's just an example of making something explicitly important. We began with the idea that we were going to focus on social emotional learning, right? I'm looking at Valerie. Valerie saying we often forget how to plan, how to implement speaking and listening standards. I also want to note, speaking and listening standards, absolutely priority. Social emotional literacy, absolute priority. A student and a teacher who do not have their social emotional needs met, they're not going to be effective learners and teachers. So that's a lot. Every single thing, my goal today was to essentially give you a sense of some things that we need to do. It all comes down to problem solving with priorities. And I like to end with this idea. I believe this is our Apollo 13 moment. I had the opportunity to become friends with the guy that's on the left. His name is Captain Jim Lovell. He actually was the captain of Apollo 13. If you read the movie, or if you read the movie, well, I guess if you read the book, if you see the movie for Apollo 13, you'll hear this: failure is not an option. That was the movie. But the man says, the tidbit that Jim says is that minds matter most. We cannot do this alone. We can't. Spend time with your teams. Survey your teachers, survey your students. Survey them weekly around your priorities. Kim Bolster at Leader Education, you have a lot of context. If you're concerned about the environment, the rearranging pieces are free. They'll help you with that. There's a set of webinars called Leader to Leader, where we're going through every single week. They're all recorded, by the way. You can do free PDs around them, thinking about how do I create urgency? How do I create priorities? What are my indicators for acceleration? There are lots of resources out there to help. Now is the time to make sure that we get all of our minds together, and that begins with you and your minds in your community. So that's what I have for you today. I know we'll have opportunities. I hope you have a great series of PDs and professional development over the summer. I hope this was helpful to you. I am going to send you a ton of things. The CDC white paper response. You'll get these slides. You'll get the study on what was actually happening. And if you reach out to any of the people that were in the chat, we'll make sure you get all the studies that are coming out this summer. We'll get you signed up for those free other additional webinars, and it'll get you the information on how to accelerate your ELLs, the information on how to think about leading with your principles from the foundation, you name it. So thank you so much for being here. Are there any additional questions from the chat? Any last questions?
I don't see anything in the chat, Kevin, but just wanted to reiterate, I will send everybody everything, and then we'll continue to reach out to Stan and Jolynn at MCEL and get you guys just continued resources. Feel free to holler anytime. We are here to help you guys, because we want you and your kids and your teachers and administrators, everyone, to be successful this fall. So thank you so much for coming today.
You know, I am looking, I see, Andrew, you had a question. How do parents sit by their kids and also work at their jobs? You know what? You don't. Actually, the neurology research says that the idea of multitasking is a fable. You can't multitask. The human brain isn't meant to do that. And so one of the things I suggest is literally think about if you're in the situation where you have parents and kids at home, remember the tyranny of the schedule. What is my time when I am going to be sitting by my kids? That might be lunchtime. One of the things that I think we are seeing is we have more grace if I am working, and just be clear with your boss, right? I'm going to have little breaks, 15-minute breaks, right? I get a break, check in with your student, have a conversation with them. There are some key questions that you can ask your student. By the way, if it is a question that can be answered with a yes or no, or the phrase nothing much, it isn't a good question. I know that because I ask it all the time for my own kids. What did you learn today? Nothing much, right? I say, no, nothing much is not in the curriculum, right? What was the most interesting thing? Ask your parents if they know the words to use in conversation with their kids or the big ideas. Another, Duval started sending home little chat session things for their parents every week. Really important. All right. So, but you can't, you're not going to be able to do that. And by the way, if that's where we end up being for the whole next year because of COVID, then we need to simply honor that is where it's at, but not lie to ourselves. Right. Looking here. All right. Looks pretty good. Thank you guys. This will be recorded. We'll see you on the next one. Take care.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.